Today we're talking about politics in the first half of the 19th century, basically 1815, after the defeat of Napoleon, to 1848, 1849, and the revolutions, all of which were more or less aborted. That is to say, they simply did not succeed. So 1815 to 1848, what was happening? We can describe this as a period as reaction, and then revolution, and then reaction again. And what is going on? Well, think back to the French Revolution. The French Revolution had given Europe a sort of a new look. Liberalism, nationalism, revolution, radical revolution, democracy, all of these things were more or less addressed by the French Revolution. So it introduced really sort of the whole idea of revolution, and revolution as the transformation of society, right? Revolution as in getting rid of the monarchs, revolution as in constitutions and liberal rights. Those are the things that the French Revolution brought. Those are the things that Napoleon carried to Europe in many ways. And those were the things that Europe wanted to stop and then put the monarchs back on their thrones and essentially put the aristocracies of Europe back in their privileged positions as much as possible. And that's exactly what would happen, or at least that was the attempt in 1815, the Congress of Vienna, when the powers came together to try and roll history back and would attempt to either get rid of constitutions, to get rid of the whole notion of civil liberty, civil rights, and would attempt to reinstall the aristocracies in their privileged positions and put the kings back on their thrones. Didn't work for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's impossible to push history back. It's impossible to stop development. It's impossible to stop the Industrial Revolution, which was dislocating many workers, which was essentially helping to introduce a kind of a middle class as commerce develops, a new industrial class. And really, the new social and industrial and economic conditions were essentially developing or helping to produce populations which wanted to get rid of privileges and wanted to impose limits on monarchs. The reason that reaction doesn't quite work also is because the various European powers don't really agree with each other about anything. For example, the English England is still very much concerned with its colonies, with its empire abroad, and would simply like there to be a sort of a balance of power on the continent. France, of course, defeated power, would like to be restored as much as possible, but other countries don't want to see a strong France, so essentially there is a willingness to sort of tolerate the growing power of the Germanys, even of Prussia. At the same time, though, that Austria, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire as it comes to be called, is very jealous of the growing power of Prussia. At the same time, you've got Russia on the eastern flank, which of course wants to enlarge its power and wants to have a greater voice in Europe. And of course, many of the powers would like anything but that. So really, there's no real agreement as to what should happen. Many of the powers, the conservative monarchies in Russia, for example, and Prussia, they want, and especially Austria, they want to have the right to intervene in revolutions in the future. England, however, does not want that to happen because England will gain by revolutions, for example, in the Americas against the Spanish crown. So there's not real consensus, and it's not a surprise, therefore, that you're going to end up having waves of various revolutions. In 1820, there's some minor revolutions, and one in Spain, another one in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Remember that Italy is not unified. And even another one in Russia, believe it or not, in December of 1825, the Decembrist revolt. These revolts were all known as the revolts of the colonels. That is to say, the kind of middle-class officers who still find their way barred to upper or higher offices in the military. So they're really about opening up position to talent, something that the French Revolution had talked about. All of these revolutions, well, they all have some success, but not the kind of success that the 1830 revolutions are going to have. In 1830, there's another wave, one in France and the Belgians. And in Belgium, for example, which actually was attached to the Netherlands as a single country, there's a lot of dissent because the Belgians are underrepresented in there is a constitution, there is a democratic assembly, but the Belgians have a larger population but no more representation. They have to share equally in the debt, although most of the debt is actually Dutch debt. The official language is Dutch, not the French-speaking Belgians or Walloon population as they're known. So the Belgians will revolt against the Dutch, and that is the beginning of the independence of Belgium. Hence, this was a liberal revolution, and it does succeed. What emerges is that Belgium has its own king. It has a very liberal constitution and liberal rights which are protected in that constitution. The French Revolution likewise gets rid of Charles X, a very conservative king, who attempted to restore many of the powers, including primogeniture, that is to say, handing down the estate to the eldest son. Charles had attempted to essentially restore the powers of the ancient aristocracy, and that leads to the revolt that occurs, and the result is a new king on the throne. The number of people who can vote is enlarged, so suffrage is expanded, but not a great deal. Nevertheless, France has a constitutional monarchy, which means something after 1830. And those are the main changes that have occurred. And then, of course, yet in 1848, there'd be another wave of revolutions. And these are far more serious. The earlier ones were more or less liberal revolutions. They all had some success, but not a great deal of success. But the revolutions of 1848 are going to try to push a little bit further in a number of cases. In France, you have a revolution which is based to some extent on the working class. And let me explain this. Let me just back up just a moment a little bit. One of the French philosophers, Louis Blanc, talked about the organization of work. And his phrase was national workshops. Put everybody to work in national workshops. Let them be subsidized by the government so that workers can buy their own means of production, their own machinery, have their own factories, and they wouldn't be exploited anymore. He wrote a book called Organization of Work, and proposed exactly that in 1839. Revolution breaks out in 1848, February of 1848. It's a combination of kind of the middle class revolution, which wants more rights, wider suffrage, and even universal manhood suffrage, and the working class, which wants some sort of protection, which wants some sort of guarantees, and which is very much influenced by the ideas of Louis Blanc. The result is that after the revolution occurs, there is a provisional government which comes into place. It does include Louis Blanc, but very few others would regard themselves as socialist, or very few others, if any others, actually supported the idea of the organization of work. The organization of work meaning, as I said, that workers would become independent, they would control their own production, they would not be exploited by anybody. The idea of the provisional government that comes into power is that instead of the organizational work being these independently owned by the workers factory production, would essentially be sort of like a welfare system where people would simply be given a sort of a dole, keep them off the streets more or less. And that's not going to work, particularly in Paris, where so many workers end up and so many are unemployed. The idea was to put 100,000 into these, not the kind of social workshops talked about by Blanc, but these national workshops, to put 100,000 of them into these workshops. But there's 200,000 people who want to be in them in Paris, and not only that, but the amount they're being paid is very little. And what happens finally is, it takes a few months, but the government decides that it's too dangerous to have these people around, and it decides to disband the workshops altogether. So, it doesn't pursue Louis Blanc's idea, it doesn't pursue even the workshops as a form of welfare. When this proposal comes up and many people are to be deported, maybe the workers are to be deported from Paris, what happens is yet another revolution, this time a working class revolution, more or less, and it's put down in a very bloody way. And that's the end of this, really what could be called a social revolution. It was really a serious working class social revolution. Almost reminds us of Karl Marx. By the end of the year, there's an election for the presidency, and guess who comes to power? None other than Louis Napoleon, the same family as the great Napoleon I. Louis Napoleon is the president for a couple of years. By 1852, he proclaims himself the emperor. That's the end of revolution. That's the end of any serious change and transformation in France. There's other revolutions that are more or less national revolutions. That's because the Austro-Hungarians, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Austrian kings or emperors controlled other populations, the Hungarians, for example, the Czechs, for example, and those peoples, the Czechs, the Hungarians, and others, want their own state, and they're going to revolt in order to accomplish that. They will be put down by the Austrians, by the army, by the emperor, and the result is that these national revolutions are also put off. So what has been accomplished? Not a lot. 1848, all of the attempts to kind of liberalize government, to impose constitutions, to protect civil liberties, and even serious social legislation, it all fails. 1848 is not a step forward for many people, and that's the end of that era. Hope that sound is not the camera.